Okay, let's unpack this. Think for a moment about uh, just the sheer scale of how we humans organize ourselves.
Yeah, billions of us living together.
Mostly, you know, not descending into total chaos, which is kind of amazing when you think about
It's
it.
true.
We form all sorts of groups, right? Families, communities, clubs, companies, all that.
Sir, all levels of association.
But there's this one type of entity that seems to sit above, well, almost all of them.
Mm-hmm. The big one.
Yeah, demanding our allegiance, setting the rules, and claiming like the ultimate authority over a specific patch of the planet.
And that entity is the state.
Exactly.
It's not just, a place on a map or the people there.
Right.
It's a concept, a structure, a whole historical thing that shapes pretty much everything.
Everything. Like what?
Well, the money in your pocket, the laws you follow, how we deal with people outside our own borders, it's huge.
It really is fundamental. And maybe something we take for granted a lot of the time. So that's what we're diving into today. What is the state, really? What makes it different?
Where did the idea even come from?
Yeah. And where's it heading? Especially now, in a world that feels, I don't know, super connected, but also kind of fragmented sometimes.
Well, to guide us through this, we're leaning on a really solid academic source.
Okay.
It's excerpts from An Introduction to Political Theory by O.P. Gauba. It gives us that robust, scholarly framework.
Good. So our mission here is to take this foundational concept, the state, and really dig in.
Get under the hood.
Yeah. We want to understand the different ways people have thought about it, trace its long, kind of twisty history,
See what makes it tick, its core components.
and look at the big challenges it's facing right now. The goal is for you, our listener, to come away with a clearer, maybe more nuanced picture of this political structure that, well, defines so much of our world.
And to really get a handle on the state today, it helps to know just how central, how absolutely dominant this idea used to be in politics.
Right, because it wasn't always just one topic among many, was it?
Not at all. For a long time, political science was basically the study of the state. It wasn't a chapter. It was, like you said, the whole book.
The whole book. Wow.
Yeah, the source mentions some figures who really highlight this. R.G. Gettle, for instance, just flat out said political science is the science of the state.
Simple as that.
And J.W. Garner went even further. He said political science begins and ends with the state.
Begins and ends. That's
It really reflects an era where the state was seen as the absolute center of political life, power, everything.
So if you studied politics back then, you studied the state. Full stop.
Pretty much.
But that kind of, laser focus rarely lasts forever, does it?
Yeah.
Especially in academic fields. How did that start to change?
Well, it hit some serious challenges, particularly with the rise of what's called the behavioral approach in political science.
The behavioralists.
Right.
They focus more on, actual human behavior in politics.
Exactly. Empirical observation, data, analyzing what people actually did, politically speaking. And they found the traditional concept of the state, well, a bit problematic.
Problematic enough that some folks apparently wanted to just ditch the term altogether. That sounds pretty radical.
It was. Their objections were quite specific, though.
Okay, like what?
Well, one big one was that the concept of the state felt too formal, too legalistic.
Formal, meaning
Meaning it focused too much on the official institutions, the laws on paper, the government structures. They argued that real politics, power, influence, conflict, negotiation happens everywhere, not just inside those formal boxes.
So focusing only on the state meant you missed a lot of the actual political action, the messy stuff.
That was the argument. It was seen as too caught up in the rules, not the actual game being played.
Okay, so too formal. What else?
Another critique was that definitions of the state often got tangled up in its ends or purposes.
Its goals. Like promoting justice or something?
Exactly what it should be or should do. And the behavioralists felt that pulled the discussion away from scientific analysis.
Because that sounds more like philosophy, maybe. Morality.
Precisely. They wanted to study politics based on observable facts, empirical data. Defining the state by its ideal goals dragged things into moral philosophy, away from studying political behavior as it actually, happened.
Got it. Formalism. Getting bogged down in philosophy. Was there a third major issue?
Yeah, the third point was about scope. They argued that defining the state as this very specific thing, formal, territorial, sovereign, meant the concept just didn't fit lots of human societies.
Like older societies, or ones without a big central government.
Exactly. Think pre-state societies or stateless ones, maybe nomadic tribes or communities that manage their affairs without that kind of centralized structure.
But they still had politics, right? Power, rules.
Absolutely. They clearly had political organization, but they didn't fit the standard state definition.
So the worry was that the definition was too narrow, that it made it seem like politics only existed in this one specific European-style state form.
Yeah, it risked presenting one historical model as universal, potentially ignoring other ways humans have organized themselves politically throughout history.
Okay, that makes sense. And this led to some strong conclusions.
It did. David Easton, a major figure here, really laid out the ambiguities in his work Political System. He showed how state was used to mean totally different things.
Like what?
Sometimes it meant a moral ideal, sometimes an instrument of oppression, sometimes just a part of society, sometimes just the government, sometimes this unique political entity. It was all over the place.
That does sound like a recipe for confusion, if you're trying to be scientific about it.
Totally. And based on that, Easton famously concluded that the word state, for analytical purposes, ought to be abandoned entirely.
Abandoned entirely. Wow. From being the whole subject to being kicked out of the vocabulary.
A dramatic shift, for sure.
So did political scientists just stop talking about the state then?
Well, no, not really. The concept turned out to be pretty resilient. And necessary, actually.
How so?
This critique was strong, especially in certain circles, maybe mid-20th century liberal theory, but other traditions kept the state front and center. Marxist theory, for instance.
Okay. How did Marxists keep the state relevant in their thinking?
For Marxists, the state wasn't just some abstract idea or formal structure. It was deeply tied to the economy, right? The mode of production, class relations.
The base and superstructure idea.
Exactly. They analyzed history through different types of states linked to class structures, the slave-owning state, the feudal state, the capitalist state.
So for them, the state was fundamentally about class, power, an instrument of rule.
Precisely. An instrument of class, rule, and oppression. Central to understanding history, power, revolution. It was anything but irrelevant or merely formal to them.
Okay, so one major theoretical tradition kept it alive.
Yeah.
What about the more empirical side, the ones who were critical? Did they come back to it?
They did, actually, in a practical way. Political scientists studying newly independent countries, after decolonization.
Right, in the post-colonial era.
They found the concept of state building incredibly useful.
State building. What did that involve?
It was all about the practical nuts and bolts of setting up functioning political institutions where maybe they didn't exist before, or were weak. Constitutions, government departments, bureaucracies.
So the state as a practical institutional mechanism.
Exactly. It showed that even if the abstract concept was debated, the concrete reality of state formation and making government work was still a huge focus.
And then, wasn't there a more formal comeback in the 1980s?
Yes, definitely. Famously captured by the phrase, bringing the state back in. Vitas Scapel is a key name associated with this.
Bringing the state back in. What did that mean conceptually? Was it just going back to the old view?
Not quite. It marked a significant shift. It wasn't just seeing the state as institutions or as just reflecting society.
Yeah.
The state started being seen as an active agent.
An active agent. Like, it has its own goals and power, independent of society.
Kind of, yeah. This view argued that the state itself has interests, bureaucratic interests, institutional survival, maybe national security goals, and it has its own capacity to shape society, the economy, political outcomes.
So not just a neutral playing field or a puppet of social forces.
Right. It could pursue its own agenda, develop policies that weren't just dictated by, say, corporations or labor unions. It had autonomy.
That's fascinating. So it went from being possibly obsolete to practically necessary to being seen as this powerful independent actor. Quite the journey for one concept.
It really shows that while we debate its meaning and importance, the core idea of the state remains, well, indispensable for understanding politics, power, how we organize ourselves.
Which brings us right back to the basic question. Okay, it's important, it's debated, but what is it? How do we define this thing today?
The definition question, yeah, crucial. And as we touched on, while political organization is ancient, the concept of the state as we use it now is relatively modern.
Modern, like how modern?
The source points to Niccolo Machiavelli, early 16th century, as really key for the contemporary understanding.
Machiavelli. Okay, the prince, power politics. What was his contribution to defining the state?
In The Prince, he talked about the state as the power which has authority over men. What's significant, the source highlights, is his focus. He looked at the nature of the thing, power, authority, Not so much its ends or moral purpose, which was the big focus for earlier philosophers. He was looking at what it was and did, practically speaking.
More pragmatic, less about the ideal, more about the reality of power.
Exactly, and that focus on the means became central later on. You really see it in Max Weber's hugely influential definition.
Weber, okay, sociologist, what was his take?
Weber deliberately tried to define the state not by its goals, but by the specific means it uses.
And that specific means was?
Physical force, the use of physical force.
Okay, but lots of people or groups might use force, right? Criminals, rebels.
But that's where Weber's full definition is crucial. He said, a state is a human community that successfully claims the monopoly of the legitimate use of physical force within a given territory.
Monopoly and legitimate. Okay, let's break that down. Monopoly.
Monopoly means the state claims to be the only one with the right to use force within its borders, if anyone else uses force.
Like police.
Oh,
or security guards.
Well, the police are part of the state apparatus, but say a private security firm, or even you defending yourself according to Weber's view, they only have the right to use force because the state permits it.
Wow. Okay.
Any unpermitted use of force is deemed illegal, and the state will act against it. The source quotes Weber saying the state is the sole source of the right to use violence.
So the state holds the ultimate authority card on using force.
That's the idea.
And what about legitimate? What does that add?
Legitimate means this monopoly on force is generally accepted as rightful, or at least the state successfully claims it's rightful. It's not just brute power. There's an implication of acceptance, of rightness, of authority that's seen as valid by the population or a significant part of it.
That's a really powerful definition. Monopoly on legitimate force within a territory. Did other thinkers add other important dimensions?
Oh, absolutely. R.M. McCulver, for example, emphasized how the state uniquely covers the entire population in a territory.
Everyone within the borders.
Right. And its job is maintaining social order through government, which he said speaks with the voice of law. Later, he and C.H. Page stressed the state's exclusive investment with the final power of coercion.
So McCulver hits on total coverage, law, and that final coercive power.
Yep. Then you have Harold Lasky, who focused on obligation. He contrasted voluntary groups, clubs, churches, whatever, which you can join or leave,
right,
with the state. Living in a state means compulsory obedience to its commands. He called the state the crowning point of society because of this supreme authority.
Choice versus compulsion. That's a clear line.
Frederick Watkins zeroed in on sovereignty. Defined the state as a geographically delimited segment of human society united by common obedience to a single sovereign.
Sovereign again, that supreme final lawmaking power.
Exactly. And Jeffrey Roberts tried to pull these threads together into a working definition. Basically, a territorial area, a population governed by authorities, successfully claiming compliance with its laws, and able to enforce that compliance through its monopoly on legitimate force.
Okay, that sounds like it covers the main points. Territory, people, government, authority, obedience, and that special control over force.
Right. If you look across these key definitions, those elements keep popping up as essential. A place, territory, people, population, a ruling mechanism, government authority, and that ultimate distinctive power, sovereignty coercion.
So these definitions really point us toward the core building blocks. Let's break down those four essential elements the source identifies: population, territory, government, and sovereignty.
Sounds good. Let's start with the obvious one.
Population. You need people, right?
Absolutely. The state's a human thing, but it's not just any collection of people. The source says there needs to be some kind of unity.
Unity, like everyone being the same.
Not necessarily uniformity. More like interdependence, a shared sense of common interests, and a general respect for common rules and institutions. People need to sort of see themselves as part of this collective entity.
Does the number of people matter?
Could a state be tiny?
Or huge?
The source says size can't be fixed. You have microstates and massive ones like India or China. But it does mention an idea about economic self-sufficiency being good for stability.
Being able to pay its way, trade for what it needs.
Yeah, although foreign aid can be a factor too, at least temporarily.
What about homogeneity? Do people need the same background, language, religion?
The source is really clear on this. No, homogeneity is not essential for the modern state. Modern states are diverse. Their whole claim often is to manage and reconcile the interests of different groups, race, religion, language, culture, under one political roof.
Okay, so population. The human base, needing some common ground, but definitely not uniformity. Next element, territory.
Territory, the physical space, absolutely crucial. This is where the state exercises its authority, and that authority is supposed to be supreme within those borders.
Unlike other groups that might be spread out or just exist within a state.
Exactly. The state is fundamentally tied to a fixed place. The source mentions Engels, pointing out how state formation involved dividing people by territory, not just by kinship like older tribal societies. Your rights and duties became tied to where you lived.
And it's fixed territory essential today.
While some debated it historically, the modern view, which the source supports, is yes, fixed territory is essential. You can't really have a state as we understand it without defined borders.
And other countries need to recognize those borders,
Yes.
right, for international relations.
Pretty much. International law sees fixed territory as fundamental. Defining those boundaries is key to a state's identity and how it interacts with others.
What counts as territory? Just the land.
Yeah. No, it's more. It's the land, the internal waters, rivers, lakes, the airspace above, and usually a strip of the sea off the coast territorial waters. The source mentions the old 3-mile limit, but notes it can be extended.
And why is territory so important beyond just being the physical location?
Oh, it's huge, symbolically and practically. It represents sovereignty. This is our space where our rules apply. It provides resources, security, opportunity.
And emotionally, too, right? Patriotism.
Definitely. It's often the object of deep attachment, the motherland, fatherland. That shared connection to a place can be a powerful unifier, even for diverse populations.
Does the size of the territory matter? Big versus small?
Like population, size isn't fixed. Boundaries can be geographical, but often they're political, based on where people feel they belong.
Right.
And borders can change, states merge, split, new ones form.
Okay, so we have the people, population in a place, territory.
Yeah.
How does the state actually do anything, run things?
That's where the third element, government, comes in. The source calls it essential, the agency or machinery of the state. Remember Garner's quote, "Government is how policies are decided and affairs are regulated."
So the state is the abstract idea. The government is the concrete thing that acts.
Exactly. Government is the visible part. It exercises the state's authority. It makes laws, enforces them, runs the courts, maintains order, handles defense, provides services, roads, schools, health, currency, foreign relations.
All the stuff we see day to day.
Right, and it levies taxes to pay for it all. Without a government, the state basically stops functioning. It's just people in a territory with no direction.
And when we interact with the state, we're usually dealing with the government, getting a license, paying taxes.
Yep, that's the interface. And internationally, it's governments that make treaties or declare war on behalf of their states.
This difference between state and government feels really important. The source stresses they're not the same thing.
Absolutely vital distinction. McCulver's line is great here. The state is the organization, greater than the organ, the government.
Meaning governments can change, but the state can continue.
Right. Governments come and go, elections, coups, whatever. But the state itself can endure if the change happens according to its own established rules, like its constitution.
So a new party winning an election doesn't mean a new state. But when does a state actually lose its identity or disappear?
The source says that happens if it's suppressed by an outside power that conquers it and dismantles its system for forming a government. If the established procedure is suspended or destroyed, the sovereign entity ceases to exist, even if the people still feel like a nation and want independence back later.
Okay, that clarifies it. State is the framework, government is the operator currently in charge.
And this matters symbolically, too. The state is often the symbol of unity, the thing people feel patriotic about. The government is just the current working arrangement.
So you can criticize the government, but still love your country.
That's the idea, fundamental in democracies. Loyalty is to the state, obedience to the government's laws. But the source adds a crucial point. Our duty to the state depends on the government's character.
Meaning?
If the government becomes corrupt or unjust, and there's no way to change it through established procedures, the state's own credibility suffers. The government has to live up to the state's image as protector of common interests. Different political theories see this differently, of course.
Right. Idealists might merge them. Liberals demand accountability. Marxists see both as tools of class.
Exactly. It's viewed through different lenses.
Okay. Population, territory, government. What's the final, maybe the most defining element?
Sovereignty, the big one.
Supreme power.
That's it. The supreme, ultimate power within the state. The final authority to make laws, set political goals, resolve conflicts, and, crucially, enforce all this with legitimate force. It's the last word over the population and territory.
This sounds like what Weber and Watkins were getting at that ultimate authority.
It's the core concept. The government exercises this power, but the power itself belongs to the state. Sovereignty is what lets the state make binding laws, demand obedience, punish offenders, and deal independently with other states.
And it's supreme over everything else within its borders, other groups, customs.
That's the claim. The state's commands are superior. And remember, Weber, the state, claims the sole right to authorize violence. Any force used by others is either permitted by the state or illegal.
So no sovereignty, no state.
According to this framework, yes, a state exists as long as it's sovereign. Lose that internal collapse, external conquest, and the state disappears.
What about other countries recognizing it? Is that needed for sovereignty?
Important point the source makes here. International recognition is usually an outcome of sovereignty, not a precondition.
Meaning a state can exist and be sovereign even if nobody recognizes it.
It can. If it effectively controls its territory and population, it possesses sovereignty in reality, even if other states refuse recognition for political reasons. The source mentions Bangladesh early on, or the long waits for recognition for the USSR or People's Republic of China. Recognition is about foreign policy, not the internal reality of sovereign power.
Okay, so sovereignty is internal power and independence. Recognition is external acceptance. Got it. Population, territory, government, sovereignty, the four pillars. But the state doesn't exist in a vacuum, right? It's surrounded by other human groups. How does it relate to them?
That's the next critical piece. State versus society, state versus civil society, state versus nation. Making these distinctions isn't just academic, the source argues. It's vital for clarity and for protecting individual freedom from state overreach.
Let's start with the big confusion. State and society. People mix these up all the time.
They do, and clarity is key. The source defines the state, remember, as society politically organized. Society itself is much broader.
How broad?
It's the sum total of human association. Everything needed for life, cradle to grave. All our relationships, family, friends, work, custom, morality, contracts. It covers all aspects, physical, emotional, intellectual, spiritual. It's the whole fabric.
The whole human fabric. And the state is just one part of that fabric.
It's the part specifically organized for political purposes. It meets the need for binding rules, order, security, common services enforced by law and government. State relationships are mainly command obedience. Societal relationships are way more diverse. Love, cooperation, competition, culture.
So society is the whole ocean. The state is like the system of shipping lanes and lighthouses within it.
That's a decent analogy. Now, sometimes the people in a society and a state might overlap a lot, like, say, French society and the French state. But not always.
How so?
You can have smaller societies within a state, a village. Social ties can extend beyond a state, international family, online communities. And crucially, you can have society without a state. Think of those early tribal groups.
So society came first. It's more fundamental.
The source argues yes. Society is primary. The state emerged from society. Society relies on people. The state relies on society being organized. Society is seen as enduring. States come and go. We're social animals by nature. The state is a feature of civilization. Its form changes.
McOver's quote really drove this home.
Yeah, he lists things like family, church, custom, competition, friendship, all social things not created by the state. The state just regulates the outstanding external relationships. He argues we owe more to society than the state.
And blurring this line is dangerous.
The source warns against it. If you equate the state with all of society, you risk demanding total subordination of the individual to the government, treating the state as if it is society, which can justify unchecked power.
Okay, clear distinction there. Society is the broad context, state is the political organization within it. Now, what about civil society? That's another key term, and its meaning seems to have shifted.
It has a really interesting history. Originally, civil society often just meant the state or political society, a civilized community under law.
Like when Locke or Rousseau talked about people leaving the state of nature to enter civil society.
Exactly. For them, entering civil society was forming the state, setting up a political authority to protect rights.
So when did the distinction we use more often today emerge?
Thinkers like Hegel started drawing clearer lines. He saw civil society as the sphere of universal egoism, the economy, private interests, where people interact to meet their own needs.
The marketplace, essentially.
Kind of. And he contrasted that with the state, which he viewed as the sphere of universal altruism, representing the collective good.
Interesting distinction. What about Marx?
Marx took Hegel's description of civil society as the economic realm, but argued the state wasn't some separate altruistic sphere. He saw the state, superstructure, as fundamentally serving the interests of the dominant class in civil society, the economic base. The capitalist state served capitalist interests.
So for Marx, civil society determined the state.
Pretty much. Gramsci built on this, seeing civil society, family, schools, church, and political society, police, courts, as two levels of the superstructure maintaining capitalist domination. Civil society was key for creating hegemony, ruling through consent and shared values.
Civil society is a place where dominant ideas are spread.
Right. More recently, thinkers like Marcuse stressed keeping the distinction alive. He worried that under capitalism, the economy dominated civil society, while under communism, the state absorbed civil society. He saw the independence of both as crucial for protecting civil liberties.
So keeping them separate is important for freedom. What's the common meaning of civil society today, then?
Generally, it refers to that realm of intermediate associations, groups between the individual or family and the state.
Like what kind of groups?
NGOs, charities, community groups, unions, professional bodies, churches, social movements, activist groups, all those voluntary organizations. They're seen as emerging from the freedom of association, a bedrock of liberty.
And what do these groups do? What's their function?
They play several vital roles. The Source brings in Alexis de Tocqueville and his observations on America.
Tocqueville, right. He worried about democracy leading to too much centralized state power.
Exactly. With aristocracy gone, he worried about the tyranny of the majority and saw voluntary associations as crucial checks and balances.
How so? As counterweights.
Precisely. They could organize and voice different opinions, preventing state dominance. They encouraged people to solve problems themselves, rely less on the state. They drew people into public life, acting as schools of democracy, teaching civic virtue.
So they foster an active, engaged citizenry.
That was Tocqueville's view. He championed freedom of association parties, press, and all these other groups. He saw them as society acting upon itself, independent of the state.
So in a democracy, civil society is really important.
Seen as vital, an organ of democracy, a space for expression outside government control, promotes participation. David Held defined it as those areas outside the state, domestic life, economy, culture, political interaction through voluntary means.
A space for people to organize and act on their own.
Yes. Theorists like Cohen and Arato see it as distinct from both state and market, a sphere of public activity supplementing democracy. Paul Hurst even proposed associative democracy, where voluntary groups take on more public functions, reducing state power.
Shifting power away from the state towards these groups. That's a big idea.
And Robert Putnam's work on social capital links a vibrant civil society directly to a healthy democracy. Participation builds trust, reciprocity, the social capital needed for cooperation. His book, Bowling Alone, lamented the decline of this participation.
So a strong civil society equals a strong democracy, potentially.
That's a strong argument. Civil society is also seen as a defense against totalitarianism.
How? Because totalitarian states try to control everything.
Exactly. They try to crush or co-opt independent groups, leaving individuals isolated. The Source notes how in former communist states, groups like independent unions or churches became sites of opposition.
Like Solidarity in Poland, building a parallel society.
Precisely. Or Eko-Glasnost in Bulgaria. These movements used civil society spaces to challenge the state. After 1989, civil society became a buzzword for reviving citizen participation and checking state power. It's also linked to new social movements.
What are those? New social movements.
The Source describes them as movements often working outside traditional parties. In the West, think environmentalism, feminism, peace movements. In developing countries, they tackle human rights, poverty, environmental issues, empowering people often without direct state involvement.
So civil society is the arena where these movements can organize and push for change.
Often, yes, provided the basic freedom speech association are protected. The Source has a helpful table summarizing state versus civil society. State, formal structure, supreme legal authority, sovereignty, compulsory jurisdiction, functions of law to approve their massive resources like taxes versus civil society. Loose voluntary groups, moral authority, no compulsion, mobilizes citizens, relies on donations, grants, mainly in advanced societies.
That table clarifies the differences. But civil society isn't always purely good, right? The Source adds a critique.
Crucial point. Yes, civil society can empower people, solve problems locally. The Source mentions examples from Mexico City and Nigeria. But the groups within civil society aren't automatically democratic or benign.
They can be elitist. Or pursue bad goals.
Exactly. The source warns about civil society groups using democratic freedoms for undemocratic ends, promoting exclusion or violence. It mentions the Carapintadas in Argentina, Inkatha in South Africa as examples.
So we need to be critical even of civil society groups.
The source suggests yes. Vigilance is needed not just towards the state, but also towards these uncivil elements that might misuse the space of civil society.
Okay, that adds important nuance. Now let's connect the state to another huge concept, the nation. We often talk about the nation state.
Very intertwined concepts today, definitely. The modern state usually identifies with a specific nation. National borders, national interests, international relations, it's all framed nationally. But we need to distinguish nation from nationality.
Okay, nation versus nationality, what's the difference?
Nationality, the source explains, is more like a sentiment based on shared background, maybe common race, language, religion, culture, history, often things you're born into. These ties can unite, but they can also create division, us versus them.
And a nation is broader than that.
The source argues for a broader view. A nation is a people settled in a specific territory, sharing a sense of unity, common political goals, shared history and destiny. Importantly, this national identity can transcend different nationalities within that territory.
So you can have different ethnic or religious groups united as one nation within a state.
Yeah.
Based on shared political life and territory.
Yes, it's a political and historical bond forged within the state structure. And this idea of nationhood ideally implies equality between nations. This led to the principle of national self-determination.
Self-determination. The idea that each nation should have its own state. That became huge after World War I, right?
Absolutely. The source mentions Woodrow Wilson applying it to redraw European maps, and Lenin seeing it as the right of colonies to gain independence.
And the UN pushed this forward, too.
Yes, post-WWII documents enshrined it as a fundamental right, driving decolonization.
For those newly independent countries, getting statehood wasn't the end of the story, though. They faced nation building.
A massive task. Independence movements created unity against the colonizer, but the new state often contained diverse groups who didn't automatically see themselves as one nation. Nation building was about forging that shared identity and loyalty within the new state borders.
And the source says this is harder if there's lots of inequality or neocolonialism.
Yes, that's a major obstacle. Neocolonialism isn't direct rule, but economic domination by powerful nations.
How does that work?
Using developing nations for cheap resources and labor as markets for expensive goods. They need technology but pay heavily for it, often trapping them in debt or unfavorable trade. Foreign aid can create dependency, and the brain drain skilled people leaving hurts too. This economic vulnerability makes building a strong, unified nation harder.
Economic power keeping countries dependent, even after political independence. What about socialism? Didn't it originally reject the nation state?
It did. Marx's workers have no country view. But the source says harsh realities meant socialist states ended up operating as nation states. And after the Cold War, many former socialist countries reemerged specifically as independent nation states.
So the nation-state model proved incredibly persistent, even against ideologies that opposed it.
It seems so. And paradoxically, this stable system of nation-states has allowed for more international cooperation, international law, organizations like the UN. But the source reminds us exploitation continues in these newer economic forms.
Okay, so the nation-state is the dominant model, deeply linked with the idea of nation, born from history, facing internal and external challenges. This brings us to its current situation. Is it really up to the job in the 21st century?
That's the big question the source raises. Just like older state forms, Greek city-states, Rome, feudalism eventually couldn't cope with changing conditions. Maybe the modern nation-state is reaching its limits too.
Why? What are the signs it might be insufficient now?
Several things. One is that persistent gap between the neat idea of one nation, one state, and the messy reality.
Like nations spread across states, or states with multiple competing groups.
Exactly. Kurds across borders, or states that broke up like Yugoslavia or Czechoslovakia because groups couldn't cohere into one nation. Plus, migration means people have ties and loyalties that cross borders more than ever.
Beyond those internal issues, what about the huge global problems?
Security is a massive one. Modern weapons, especially nuclear ones, no single state can guarantee safety anymore. A major conflict has global consequences.
And environmental problems definitely don't stop at borders.
Not at all. Pollution, climate change, these are inherently global. One country's actions affect everyone, requires global solutions.
The information revolution must play a role too.
Huge role. Instant communication, the global village. Ideas, news, culture, they flow across borders constantly. This, plus easy travel, fuels economic globalization.
And the flip side is that criminals and terrorists use this too.
Right. Organized crime, drug trafficking, terrorism, they operate globally, using the same tools. Fighting them requires international cooperation on a whole new level.
So security, environment, information, economy, crime, all these massive borderless issues seem to point beyond the nation state.
That's the argument the source presents here, that the nation-state, designed for a different era, struggles with these challenges. It concludes that the state must adapt, play a new role, requiring necessary adjustment in its authority and sovereignty.
Adjustment in sovereignty. That sounds major. Given sovereignty is supposed to be supreme, does that mean giving up some power to international bodies?
That seems to be the implication. If problems are global, maybe solutions need pooled sovereignty, shared authority in certain areas, because power stopping at the border isn't enough anymore. And these pressures play out differently around the world.
Let's look at those contemporary trends. First, in the advanced industrial countries, the North.
Right. The source mentions the old Cold War three worlds model is less relevant now. The key division is more economic. Developed North versus developing South, roughly the old Third World, though not perfectly geographical.
So what's happening in the North, according to the source?
One view mentioned is that development follows a kind of universal logic of industrialization, driven by technology, specialization, skilled labor, service sector growth, complex organizations.
Leading to similar societies, urban, educated, individualistic.
That's the argument from some sociologists. Common traits emerge like rationalism, universal rules, achievement focus, expanded rights, a bigger state role in defining things.
But there's a critique of that it ignores culture and imposes a Western model.
Yes, critics say it downplays unique factors and basically projects the Western market society as the only path which benefits the West.
Another trend mentioned is the post-industrial society. Daniel Bell.
Right. Bell saw these advanced states moving beyond manufacturing. Service sector dominates, work is more people-oriented, knowledge and technical elites become key.
And merit matters more than property.
That was his idea. Conflict shifts from class war to group competition, and the state's role changes too.
Oh.
Bell saw the state becoming more involved in planning, regulation, welfare. Experts in bureaucracy gain influence. The source notes this brings benefits, but also challenges democracy, risks individual rights due to state power.
So in the North, service economies, knowledge elites, more state intervention, balancing protection and freedom. What about the South, the Third World?
Huge diversity there, obviously. Countries in Asia, Africa, Latin America mostly gained independence post-WWII, starting from different places, now linked by globalization.
And the end of the Cold War affected them too.
Big time. Some had socialist paths, many abandoned it. Others like China, Vietnam, Cuba adapted but kept socialist systems. China is in a unique spot. Communist power claims third world identity, also a great power. India, Pakistan getting nukes also changed things.
So no single trend. High income, marginalized regions, success stories like the Four Dragons.
Exactly. Lots of variation. Politically, instability and military rule were common, but there was a big shift towards democracy in many places, especially Latin America, late 20th century. Though setbacks happened, coups, persistent military rule elsewhere.
And they face ongoing internal challenges.
Yes. Ethnic tensions, fundamentalism, youth frustration can fuel instability. Even terrorism, the source mentions 9/11 in this context. The core task remains solving economic problems and ending exploitation, both internal and external neocolonialism.
So diverse paths in the South, dealing with development, nation building, political stability, exploitation, all within globalization.
Right. And all these trends, North and South, plus the global challenges, really underscore that the nation-state model is under serious pressure. Its future role is a massive question mark.
It's definitely clear the state isn't some fixed, unchanging thing. We've covered so much today.
From its historical dominance, through debates about its meaning, to its core elements, population, territory, government, sovereignty.
Yeah, and how it relates to society, civil society, the nation. Tracing that long evolution from tribal states to the modern nation state.
And looking at the competing poles of nationalism and internationalism leading into the current crises and trends we just discussed.
It's obvious the state is dynamic, constantly being reshaped, redefined, challenged by history and global changes.
And understanding this fundamental political unit is just so crucial for making sense of the world you live in. Local issues, global problems, it all connects back.
Absolutely. And thinking about those huge global challenges, climate, security, pandemics, whatever, and the rise of non-state actors, civil society.
It really brings into focus that question about the nation state's limits.
Exactly. Which leaves us, I think, with a pretty big thought to ponder.
Yeah. Given the scale of these global challenges today and the growing importance of actors beyond the state, can the nation state, as we've known it, as we've defined it here, really secure humanity's future on its own?
Or does its very nature, especially its sovereignty, need to undergo some kind of fundamental transformation to meet these 21st century realities?
A profound question indeed.
Definitely something to think about. Thank you for joining us for this deep dive.